Have you ever felt like everything in your life is falling apart? You wake up tired, things that used to bring you joy now feel empty. People you once felt close to seem distant. But deep inside, there's a quiet voice, not of fear, but of awakening. Carl Jung called this a sacred sign, a moment of chaos, right before your soul enters the most beautiful chapter of your life. In the depths of what Jung termed the first half of life, we witness the curious phenomenon of an individual whose carefully constructed persona begins to show its first hairline fractures. The persona, that mask we wear to navigate the collective expectations of society, suddenly feels foreign, ill-fitting, as if one has been wearing clothing tailored for someone else entirely. Consider the executive who awakens one morning to find that the corner office, once a symbol of triumph, now feels like an elegant prison. The morning ritual of donning the professional mask becomes increasingly laborious, as if the very atoms of one's being resist this daily masquerade. Jung observed that such moments herald not catastrophe, but rather the psyche's natural progression toward individuation, that lifelong process of becoming who one truly is beneath the accumulated layers of social conditioning. The conscious mind, still clinging to familiar patterns, interprets this dissolution as failure. Yet the unconscious knows better. It recognizes that the caterpillar must liquefy before the butterfly can emerge. The ego, that narrow sentinel of consciousness, perceives only destruction where the self sees necessary transformation. This stage manifests in what Jung called divine discontent, a sacred dissatisfaction that arises not from external circumstances, but from the soul's recognition that it has outgrown its current container. The individual may experience what appears to be depression, but is actually the psyche's natural response to living inauthentically. The depression serves as a protective mechanism, slowing down the machinery of false living to create space for genuine existence to emerge. Jung reminds us that neurosis is often the psyche's attempt to heal itself, a compensatory mechanism arising when conscious attitudes become too one-sided. The person experiencing this dissolution is not falling apart. They are falling together in a new configuration that honors both their conscious aspirations and their unconscious wisdom. As the individuation process deepens, we observe the individual's gradual withdrawal from what Jung termed participation mystique, that unconscious identification with group thinking and collective values. The person begins to experience a profound sense of alienation from their former social circle, not out of misanthropy, but from an emerging recognition of their own unique psychological constellation. Jung understood that true relationship requires the presence of two individuated beings, not two personas dancing around each other in a choreography of mutual projection. The withdrawal we observe is not antisocial behavior, but rather the necessary solitude required for the emergence of authentic selfhood. Like the hermit in the tarot, the individual must journey inward before they can offer genuine wisdom to the world. This phase often triggers what Jung called the transcendent function, the bridge between conscious and unconscious contents that allows for psychological growth. The individual may find themselves drawn to solitary activities that were previously unappealing. Meditation, long walks in nature, journaling, or simply sitting in contemplative silence. These activities serve not as escapes from life, but as gateways to deeper life. The collective, sensing this withdrawal, may respond with attempts to pull the individual back into familiar patterns. Family members may express concern. Friends may feel abandoned. Colleagues may interpret the change as aloofness. Jung observed that the individuating person must develop what he called moral courage, the strength to remain true to their emerging authentic self despite social pressure to conform. This withdrawal is not permanent isolation, but rather a temporary cocoon stage necessary for psychological metamorphosis. The individual is not abandoning relationship, but rather preparing for relationships based on genuine encounter rather than mutual projection and unconscious identification. In the crucible of solitude, the individual begins to experience what Jung considered one of the most significant developments in psychological maturation: the activation of the transcendent function. This is the psyche's natural ability to bridge the gap between conscious attitudes and unconscious contents, creating new possibilities that transcend the limitations of either alone. The transcendent function manifests initially as a series of profound questions that seem to arise from nowhere. Who am I when no one is watching? What would I do if I weren't afraid? What is my life actually about? These questions emerge not from intellectual curiosity, but from the self's insistence on authentic living. Jung distinguished between the ego's questions, which seek answers that confirm existing beliefs, and the self's questions, which crack open entirely new possibilities. The individual finds themselves unable to answer these questions through conventional means. Books, advice from others, or logical analysis prove insufficient. The answers they discover must be lived into existence through direct experience. This phase often coincides with what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious. Dreams become more vivid and meaningful, synchronicities multiply, and the individual develops what might be called symbolic sight, the ability to perceive the deeper patterns and meanings underlying everyday experiences. The person may find themselves drawn to mythology, depth psychology, or spiritual traditions that honor the mystery of human existence. They begin to understand that their personal struggles are not merely individual neuroses, but participation in universal human themes that have been explored by every culture throughout history. Jung emphasized that this is not regression into primitive thinking, but rather progression toward a more complete form of consciousness that honors both rational and irrational elements of the psyche. The individual is learning to think not just with their head, but with their entire being. Jung understood that authentic transformation requires passage through what mystics have called the dark night of the soul, a period of profound psychological upheaval where the individual experiences the death of their former self without yet being reborn into their new identity. This liminal space is characterized by intense emotional lability and a sense of being suspended between worlds. The emotional storms that arise during this phase serve a crucial function in the individuation process. Jung observed that emotions are not merely psychological whether to be endured, but rather carriers of psychic energy that, when consciously engaged, can fuel transformation. The tears shed during this period are not signs of breakdown, but of breakthrough, the dissolution of psychic structures that no longer serve growth. What appears to be depression may actually be what Jung called the depressive position, a necessary stage where the ego's grandiose fantasies and inflated expectations dissolve, making space for a more humble and authentic relationship with reality. The individual learns to embrace what Jung termed the reality principle, the recognition that genuine fulfillment comes not from getting what we want, but from wanting what we have and becoming who we are. This phase often involves the emergence of what Jung called the shadow, those aspects of personality that have been repressed or denied because they conflict with our idealized self-image. The individual may discover capacities for anger, selfishness, or destructiveness that horrify their conscious personality. Yet Jung emphasized that shadow integration is essential for wholeness. We cannot become complete human beings while denying parts of our psychological reality. The dark night serves another crucial function. It burns away false supports and securities, forcing the individual to develop what Jung called inner authority, the capacity to validate their own experience rather than constantly seeking external approval. This is not narcissistic self-absorption, but rather the development of genuine self-respect and inner stability. As the storm of emotional upheaval begins to settle, the individual makes a remarkable discovery. Solitude, previously experienced as loneliness, transforms into a sanctuary of authentic being. Jung distinguished between loneliness, the painful awareness of separation from others, and solitude, the enriching experience of communion with oneself. In this sanctuary of solitude, the individual begins to encounter what Jung called the inner beloved, not another person, but the capacity for loving relationship with their own soul. This is not narcissistic self-love, but rather the development of what Jung termed philautia, the mature love of self that forms the foundation for genuine love of others. The practices that emerge during this phase, meditation, journaling, contemplative walking, artistic expression, are not mere hobbies, but what Jung considered active imagination techniques that facilitate dialogue between conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. Through these practices, the individual learns to access their own inner wisdom rather than constantly seeking guidance from external authorities. Jung observed that our culture's fear of solitude reflects a deeper fear of encountering the richness and complexity of our own inner world. The individuating person discovers that their inner world is not empty or boring, but but rather contains what he called a whole cosmos, rich with meaning, beauty, and wisdom waiting to be explored. This embrace of solitude does not indicate misanthropy or social withdrawal, but rather the development of what Jung called psychological objectivity, the ability to observe one's own psychological processes with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment and reactivity. From this foundation of self-understanding, genuine encounter with others becomes possible. The individual learns what Jung considered one of life's most important skills, the ability to be alone without being lonely, to find in their own company not just tolerance but genuine enjoyment and enrichment. In the fertile silence of authentic solitude, the individual begins to experience what Jung identified as the emergence of the intuitive function, not merely intuition as commonly understood, but what he called perception of unconscious contents and possibilities. This represents a fundamental shift from purely rational analytical thinking to what Jung termed symbolic thinking, the ability to perceive the deeper patterns and meanings that underlie surface appearances. This intuitive awakening manifests initially as an uncanny ability to know things without logical explanation. The individual develops what Jung called perspective function, the capacity to sense the potential outcomes of decisions and situations before they manifest. This is not supernatural ability, but rather the natural result of learning to attend to subtle psychological cues that the rational mind typically overlooks. Jung emphasized that intuition operates through what he called the feeling-toned complex, patterns of psychological energy that carry emotional resonance and meaning. The individuating person learns to recognize these patterns both within themselves and in their environment, developing what might be called pattern recognition at a level deeper than conscious analysis. This development of intuitive wisdom serves as an internal guidance system that Jung considered far more reliable than external authorities or social conventions. The individual learns to trust their own psychological compass, even when it points in directions that seem illogical or unconventional to others. The activation of intuitive function also brings what Jung called synthetic thinking, the ability to perceive how apparently unrelated elements connect in meaningful patterns. The person begins to see their life not as a series of random events, but as a coherent narrative with themes, patterns, and meaning that transcend immediate circumstances. Jung warned that this intuitive development must be balanced with adequate grounding in reality and practical competence. The goal is not to become a mystic who loses touch with the world, but to become what he called a practical mystic, someone who can navigate both the inner and outer worlds with skill and wisdom. As psychological maturity deepens, the individual develops what Jung considered one of the hallmarks of wisdom, the capacity for conscious letting go. This is not passive resignation or spiritual bypassing, but rather what Jung called active acceptance, the skillful ability to release attachments that no longer serve growth while maintaining engagement with life. Jung distinguished between two types of letting go: neurotic detachment, which stems from fear and avoidance, and conscious non-attachment, which arises from wisdom and love. The individuating person learns to hold their relationships, career, and even their own identity lightly, not because these things don't matter, but because they understand that clinging transforms love into possession and growth into stagnation. This capacity for letting go extends to what Jung called the transcendence of opposites. The individual learns to embrace paradox rather than seeking to resolve every tension through either slash or thinking. They develop what Jung termed the superior function, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without collapsing into relativism or indecision. The art of letting go also involves releasing what Jung called the provisional life, the tendency to postpone authentic living while waiting for ideal conditions. The person learns to engage fully with their actual circumstances rather than constantly seeking to escape into fantasized alternatives. Perhaps most significantly, this stage involves letting go of what Jung termed the inflation of the ego, the need to be right, to control outcomes, or to maintain a perfect self-image. The individual develops what Jung called psychological humility, not self-deprecation, but rather accurate self-assessment and the capacity to laugh at their own pretensions and limitations. This letting go creates what Jung described as psychic space, room for new possibilities to emerge that could not appear while the psyche was cluttered with outdated attachments and rigid identifications. In what Jung considered a hallmark of psychological maturity, the individual discovers what he called the transcendent within the mundane, the capacity to find profound meaning and beauty in ordinary experiences. This represents a fundamental shift from seeking fulfillment in extraordinary experiences to recognizing the extraordinary nature of ordinary existence. Jung observed that this development reflects the healing of what he called the modern split, the division between sacred and secular that characterizes contemporary consciousness. The individuating person learns to perceive what Jung termed the numinous, that quality of profound meaning and emotional resonance, in simple activities. Preparing a meal, walking in nature, engaging in conversation, or simply sitting quietly with awareness. This is not merely aesthetic appreciation, but what Jung called participation in the eternal, the recognition that each moment contains what he termed kairos, meaningful time, rather than merely chronos, clock time. The individual learns to inhabit their experience fully rather than constantly seeking escape into past memories or future fantasies. Jung emphasized that this capacity for presence emerges not from effort or technique, but from what he called the resolution of psychological conflicts. When the individual is no longer at war with themselves, they naturally develop the capacity for what Jung termed collected presence, the ability to be fully where they are without internal distraction or resistance. This stage also involves the development of what Jung called aesthetic consciousness, the ability to perceive beauty not just in conventionally beautiful objects, but in the patterns, rhythms, and relationships that characterize all existence. The person begins to see their own life as what Jung termed a work of art in process. Not a problem to be solved, but a masterpiece to be created through conscious living. The individual discovers that happiness is not something to be pursued, but something that emerges naturally when one is aligned with what Jung called the self, that deeper organizing principle of personality that transcends the ego's narrow concerns. As the individual becomes more aligned with their authentic nature, Jung observed a remarkable phenomenon. They begin to attract what he called constellation relationships, connections with others who resonate at a similar frequency of psychological development. This is not mere coincidence, but what Jung understood as the operation of what he termed meaningful coincidence or synchronicity. Jung explained this phenomenon through his concept of psychological resonance, the tendency for individuals operating at similar levels of consciousness to be drawn together through what he called archetypal attraction. The individuating person no longer attracts relationships based on neurotic complementarity, where two people's psychological wounds fit together like puzzle pieces, but rather on what Jung termed creative complementarity, where two whole individuals enhance each other's growth and authentic expression. These new relationships are characterized by what Jung called I-thou encounters, meetings between authentic beings, rather than between personas or social roles. Conversations in such relationships tend to move quickly beyond small talk into what Jung termed soul territory, discussions of meaning, purpose, growth, and the deeper questions of existence. Jung observed that authentic individuals naturally create what he called psychological sanctuary for others, spaces where people feel safe to be genuinely themselves without pretense or performance. This is not conscious technique, but the natural result of having developed inner security and non-judgmental awareness. The quality of empathy that emerges at this stage differs from mere emotional sympathy. Jung called it psychological empathy, the ability to understand and connect with another's inner world while maintaining clear psychological boundaries. The individual learns to offer presence without trying to fix or change others, support without enabling dependency. These constellation relationships often feel like what Jung termed recognition across time, as if the individuals involved have known each other much longer than their actual acquaintance would suggest. This reflects what Jung believed to be the collective unconscious recognition of shared archetypal patterns and similar stages of psychological development. Jung considered creativity not merely an artistic talent, but what he called the fundamental drive of the self toward expression and actualization. As individuation progresses, the person experiences what Jung termed the creative imperative, an irresistible urge to bring something new into existence through their unique psychological configuration. This creative impulse differs fundamentally from ego-driven achievement or the desire for external recognition. Jung called it creation for its own sake, the joy of participating in what he termed the ongoing creation of the cosmos through individual expression. The person discovers that they are not just consumers of culture, but active participants in what Jung called the collective creative enterprise of humanity. Jung observed that this stage often involves the emergence of what he called symbolic thinking, the ability to express complex psychological and spiritual truths through metaphor, art, story, or other symbolic forms. The individual begins to understand that their personal experiences contain what Jung termed archetypal significance, universal themes that resonate with the deeper patterns of human existence. The creative work that emerges during this phase serves what Jung called the transcendent function. It bridges conscious and unconscious contents, creating new possibilities for psychological integration and growth. Whether expressed through traditional art forms or through what Jung called the art of living, this creativity serves both personal individuation and collective cultural evolution. Jung emphasized that this creative imperative is not limited to conventionally artistic pursuits. He observed that some individuals express their creativity through what he called life as art, the conscious crafting of their existence as a coherent, meaningful, and beautiful expression of their unique being. Others might express creativity through relationships, work, teaching, or what Jung termed cultural midwifery, helping others birth their own authentic expressions. The individual discovers that when they create from authentic inspiration rather than ego desire, they tap into what Jung called the collective treasury of human wisdom and beauty, contributing their unique note to the eternal symphony of human expression. In what Jung considered one of the most profound developments in psychological maturation, the individual learns to distinguish between what he called neurotic suffering, pain that results from resistance to reality, and meaningful suffering, pain that serves growth, wisdom, and the expansion of consciousness. Jung observed that most human suffering falls into the neurotic category. Pain caused by trying to force reality to conform to our preferences, by clinging to what must be released, or by avoiding what must be faced. But meaningful suffering, Jung argued, is not only unavoidable but essential for psychological and spiritual development. The individuating person develops what Jung called a more fatty, not mere acceptance of their fate, but active love of their entire life experience, including its difficult and painful aspects. This is not masochistic self-punishment, but recognition that what Jung termed the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, requires us to embrace experiences that our natural preferences would avoid. Jung distinguished between two responses to suffering: pathological resistance, which increases suffering by fighting against what cannot be changed, and creative response, which transforms suffering into wisdom, compassion, and deeper capacity for life. The mature individual learns what Jung called the alchemy of transformation, the ability to transmute psychological lead into gold through conscious engagement with difficulty. This stage involves the development of what Jung termed tragic consciousness, the recognition that life inevitably involves loss, limitation, and mortality, and that meaning emerges not despite these facts but through our conscious response to them. The person learns to find what Jung called the treasure in the dark forest, the gifts that can only be discovered through navigation of life's most challenging terrain. Jung emphasized that this embrace of meaningful suffering does not involve seeking out pain or remaining in situations that can be improved. Rather, it involves what he called intelligent acceptance, the wisdom to know the difference between what can be changed and what must be embraced, and the courage to respond appropriately to each. In the culmination of what Jung called the individuation process, the person arrives at what he considered the supreme achievement of human psychological development, the emergence of the individuated self. This is not the completion of growth. Jung emphasized that individuation is a lifelong process, but rather the establishment of what he called conscious relationship with the self as the organizing principle of personality. Jung distinguished carefully between the ego and the self. The ego, he explained, is the center of consciousness, necessary for functioning in the world but limited in scope and perspective. The self, however, is what Jung called the archetype of wholeness, the deeper organizing principle that encompasses both conscious and unconscious aspects of personality and connects the individual with what Jung termed the transpersonal dimension of existence. The individuated person has learned what Jung called the art of conscious living, the ability to navigate life guided not primarily by external authorities, social expectations, or even personal preferences, but by what Jung termed ethical instinct, an inner sense of what serves the highest good of both individual and collective development. This does not mean the person becomes perfect or free from conflict. Jung emphasized that individuation brings not the elimination of problems, but what he called the right problems, challenges that serve growth rather than merely repeating unconscious patterns. The individuated person experiences what Jung termed creative conflict, tensions that generate new possibilities rather than mere stress. Jung observed that such individuals naturally become what he called cultural creatives, people who contribute to the evolution of human consciousness through their very being and expression. They serve what Jung termed the collective individuation process, the gradual awakening of humanity to higher levels of consciousness and creative potential. The individuated self lives what Jung called the symbolic life, existence that participates consciously in the deeper patterns and meanings that connect individual experience with universal themes. Such a person has learned what Jung considered the ultimate wisdom, how to be fully themselves while remaining connected to the larger whole of which they are part. Jung concluded that such individuals represent what he called the hope of the species, human beings who have learned to transcend the narrow confines of ego consciousness without losing practical effectiveness, who have integrated their shadow without becoming destructive, and who have connected with transpersonal wisdom while remaining grounded in human reality. In the words Jung used to describe this achievement, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The individuated person has claimed this privilege not as personal indulgence, but as their contribution to what Jung called the ongoing creation of consciousness in our world. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. Carl Jung.